mentioned via Twitter, some of you may already know this, but Lou Rocca passed on today, actually, and I wanted to acknowledge the tremendous loss in so many ways. So I want to say rest in peace and rest in power to Miri, and I, for one, am continue to be inspired. And will be as I give my remarks. I want to thank, first of all, the organizers of this very generative convening. Thank you for all of you who've put this together and donated your labor, right, when you've had many other things to do, right? Many of us here are doctoral student workers, some of us are faculty, contingent, tenure stream. We all have lots to do, so I really want to thank the organizers for doing this and for inviting the CUNY Adjunct Project to be here. It's been a really great experience today and yesterday. And I also just want to, make a shout out to us particularly as doctoral students, right? Which is that it shouldn't actually have to be us who are changing the university, right? We have so many other things that we're supposed to be doing, right? When I talk with my buddies back at the CUNY Graduate Center, right? We're trying to study, to teach, to produce research, to write, to go to conferences on money that we don't have, right? The list goes on and on and on and on and on. But apparently nobody else, and I'm being somewhat provocative here, apparently nobody else is interested in actually charging forward in this fight except for the MOOC acolytes. And I have to say that the futures market in MOOCs is booming right now, but I want to push back and say that this is just another capitalist illusion, right? That we actually have to seriously deconstruct what MOOCs actually mean and what they actually do. And as you'll see, a lot of what I'm going to say relates to, I think, the unfulfilled decolonization that still has to happen in the academy and across the world. And I'm actually particularly concerned with the way that MOOCs seem to me to be reinscribing, and not just reinscribing, but actually to be a neo-colonial form that's being exported around the world. As we see so many other Western, global, northern processes be circulated around the world against people's wishes. I also just want to say one quick thing about Mark Bousquet, who's, obviously I regret he's not here, but I want to give him props for a number of reasons. One, because he's an alumnus of my program, the CUNY Graduate Center English program, and I, for one, am very inspired by him and trying to work in his path at the Graduate Center. Two, I also just really want to give him a shout out for his super important and long-standing analyses of academic capitalism. And three, and I was going to share this with him, but he's not here, I really wanted to tell him how much I've enjoyed saying or quoting his remark in How the University Works that the PhD holder is now the waste product of graduate education. And I really enjoy saying that, particularly at department-wide English meetings, where the great majority of faculty and students look at me like I'm crazy. Some of you actually might be looking at me like I'm crazy right now, which is fantastic, right? Because we're here to sort of push the edge, I think, and I think that we've been doing that the past couple of days. So I wanted to talk about one thing in particular, but there's so many things to talk about. And I'm skipping over my notes here. I've been so overworked that I've had to write them, whether I had the time to type them up and I could read them more clearly. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about that are related, right? One is intersectional analysis and organizing. Some of these have been echoed. These are echoes of things we've talked about, right? Two is militarization. That came up particularly yesterday as the pushback to the precarious state of university higher education, in which massive construction is backed by private loans that are backed by student tuition dollars, right? And number three, I want to talk about the radical potentialities of contingency, beyond contingency as we normatively understand it today. So I'm going to try to do all three things of these together, and some of this is speculative, so please be gentle with me afterwards. So intersectional analysis and organizing. This is something that's come up yesterday and today, but I really just want to keynote it as an important aspect of our work as literary, cultural, media, interdisciplinary scholars, but precisely in the organizing work that we're doing, right? So if you look at this panel, and I say this constructively, 4 phenotypically white, cisgender presenting men, right? Now that, and I'm not blaming anybody for that. It's not about blame, right? But if you look at this room, it's primarily white as well, which is emblematic of higher education, right? Which means there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of serving underrepresented communities of students, serving underrepresented communities of doctoral students, serving underrepresented communities of faculty and staff. At CUNY, it's really hard to not intersectionally organize. You have to be willfully against that, which would be a problem to me and many others who do this kind of organizing work. I'm one of the 3 part-time organizers for the CUNY Adjunct Project, but in order to work effectively as organizers on adjunct labor, academic labor, we also have to work effectively with all the other communities and all of their other issues, right? So in New York City, as you can imagine, that means working with and alongside folks who are working against stop and frisk and police brutality and racial profiling, which directly impacts us as students and as faculty, right? Upwards of 700,000 New Yorkers, primarily black and brown young men, are stopped for no other reason than to terrorize them and their communities, right? And we know the long racialized history of this, right? Those students are in our classrooms, and we have to be able to talk to them about how the university itself is reproducing these processes, and in many ways benefiting from these processes, right? I'm speaking particularly about the military-industrial complex, right? As we all know, higher ed in many ways in the US has been developed because of the military-industrial complex. I'm also speaking particularly about the prison-industrial complex, right? Certainly people in Chicago know full well about this. People across the country know full well about this. In New York City, it's an incredible problem, right? Because so many students aren't even getting to college in the first place because they're being pushed out for particular racialized reasons, right? So I want to, again, keynote these issues. Some of these issues came to a forefront this past semester at the CUNY, in the CUNY community. And for those of you who don't know, CUNY is either the largest or one of the largest urban public universities. It's the second largest. Thank you to my comrade, Marcia Newfield down there, also from CUNY. It's the second largest urban public university in the country. There's 21 or 22 different campuses. The CUNY Graduate Center is one of them. It's the only doctoral granting facility in the whole shebang, right? So we're being pushed out to different campuses, particularly as doctoral students of English, right? We go to different campuses to teach. So we're dealing with lots of different types of communities, right? What happened in particular at City College this past semester, which is sort of a case study for wider issues of militarization that are happening at CUNY, was, as some of you may have read in various news sites, websites, blogs, what have you, the war criminal, former General David Petraeus, former CIA director, aka droner-in-chief, was appointed as an adjunct to teach at Macaulay Honors College. This was already a huge issue for a myriad of reasons, but it became an even bigger issue when multiple groups of activists and organizers, and I was part of some of these groups. CUNY Adjunct Project was out there protesting. I was part of the ad hoc committee against militarization of CUNY, which is ongoing and was the front of numerous organizations within and without CUNY working against this. And in particular, a really politically engaged and committed group of primarily undergraduates at City College named the Revolutionary Students Coordinating Committee, or RISC, and the rhyme with SNCC there is deliberate on their part. In the course of the past 4 months, not only were numerous students arrested because of protests against Petraeus and the overall militarization of CUNY, which incorporated the return of ROTC after 41 years, which is also happening on the back of an American Enterprise Institute white paper that was put out in 2011, which said, and I'm happy to provide this information later, which said that CUNY, the students of CUNY, because of their diversity and their experience, right, would be a great recruiting ground for the military, and that the military was not serving itself well enough by tapping into them, right? Now, the kind of imperialist, neo-imperialist, neoliberal conglomeration that kind of process names is really insane and should have us all really scared. And maybe we could untangle some of this in the discussion following this, right? So there was already, what I'm trying to say is, right, there was already a steady stream of militarization that was happening, right? This militarization started to be turned against students who are peacefully protesting, as it is their right, these various elements that I'm stringing together here, right? The students were also maced, as I said, arrested by both NYPD, subject to all sorts of disciplinary proceedings at City College in particular. And this all came to a head when the long-standing Morales Shakur Community and Student Center at City College, which was an autonomous space that was won for students of color back in the late 60s, early 70s, throughout the various struggles against, right, the white supremacist student body and gatekeeping at work at CUNY. They had won this space. They suddenly decided to take the space away, right? Why? In large part because they were doing organizing against militarization of CUNY, right? The CUNY administration, the City College administration, responded in quite draconian fashion at the same time that, or around the same time that, a proposed policy on quote-unquote expressive activity was quote-unquote leaked, I think deliberately leaked, by the CUNY Board of Trustees that would implement, and I say the word draconian again, a draconian curtailment of students, faculty, staff's right to peacefully protest, to assemble on campuses that are actually public, right? This is a public university. And so they charged 2 students in particular with numerous violations, including, and this is how crazy, right, in terms of the militarization, securitization scheme that the US and New York City is engaged in, and that Chicago and other places are as well, charged them with trying to incite a riot. But they were merely participating in a protest, right? And they were, and this couldn't be handled for some reason disciplinarily within City College. They were turned over to the NYPD and forced to go downtown and turn themselves into jail, right? And they had to withdraw from the semester. They're going back this coming semester, but under all sorts of crazy provisions, right? But their education has been completely interrupted because of this, right? So I guess I'm giving you all this stuff and I'm already off my illegible notes anyway, but in part this is a really big issue, right, for us at CUNY, and I want that passion to come forward, right? And so while we were talking yesterday about, you know, the pushback, the militarization pushback that's happening, right, in part because of the precarious financial situation many universities find themselves in, CUNY's not alone in that precarious financial situation, right? They're definitely on board with this in the ways that all these other schools we were talking about yesterday were. I think where they're the tipping point right now is this severe militarization pushback. And so I think that's something that we actually have to think about across all the organizing we're doing, is how, as we're moving forward to change the university, as we're thinking about new tactics, right, to potentially, to go through bond prospectuses, to think about how our protesting could potentially negatively affect interest rates, right, which would be bad for the university, good for the movement. If that militarization is going to be so strong, we have to think about that, and we have to think who's going to be putting their bodies on the line, who's at most risk for that, right? So I just want to put that out there as a major struggle. How am I doing in time? I'm good? All right. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. With contingency, and I didn't get to everything, right? But maybe we'll talk about it. Contingency, I sort of want to reclaim contingency as a radical kind of contingency that would mean possibility. The possibility that's been taken away from us by political economy over the past couple of centuries. It's been taken away by governmentality. That's been taken away by the law. And I want to be able to give ourselves the opportunity to really think and dream about what it would mean to actually conceive of collectives, of groupings, of ways of being that would be something different, right? And in order for us to do that dreaming, I propose that we have to fully decolonize the university and our world, right? Because there's a whole range of practices, life worlds, communities that we could be drawing on for inspiration that were absolutely destroyed through colonialism and imperialism, and that are still not accessible to us as literary and cultural studies practitioners because our departments are not set up to be able to teach literatures in Dari or to teach literatures in Zulu, right? So there's a big decolonization process that still has to happen, and I submit that that's what we need in order to sort of reanimate contingency as a really powerful way to think of totally upending the status quo. Thank you.
I'm going to, I think what I'm about to say is not going to be any sort of groundbreaking thing, but one of the reasons under which I've lived for the past several years is that because universities are in crisis and because departments, if they lose a tenure line by denying someone tenure, are not going to get those tenure lines back. And so departments would be crazy to let someone go. So I was let go, totally fine with that, because there's not too much love lost between me and some of my colleagues. But I guess I'm not interested in using the term precarity for myself because I in many ways have enjoyed a lot of privilege. I have a job now, my contract ends in May, and I have a job for next year. But I do want to talk about one of the precarity effects, neoliberalism's precarity effects within the process of being a faculty member. So I think that precarity effects are created. I think neoliberalism's precarity effects cast shadows in which disciplining occurs. And so I want to talk a little bit about how I think that recruitment and tenure are actually two major disciplining processes. I know a lot of you are worried about getting jobs, and so you're faced with that first effect of disciplining, shaping yourself for a job market and all of that. But tenure is definitely another moment of disciplining. And these are both moments of professionalization. It seems odd to say that once you already have a job, you have to continue to professionalize. But in fact, that's what those 6 fucking years are about, or 7 years, or whatever it is, right? those years of having to constantly conform yourself to certain ideas of what it means to be a tenured faculty member or a tenurable faculty member. So, so professionalization continues. I'm sorry, it's not, once you land a job, it actually keeps going on. And by using the term discipline, I want to say that these are actually moments where you both internalize and you're expected to internalize and externalize norms. So this is Foucault 101, right? In other words, this is about the creation of subjects. This is about the creation of people who are normal, legible scholars, not critical scholars. I mean, even within a certain kind of criticism within certain humanities fields, you have to be a legible critical scholar. You can't be an illegible critical scholar, right? So, what this meant in my case, I was actually in a political science department. So this may sound odd to think that maybe my case is generalizable in some way, because in my case in particular, political science has been beset for decades now by methodology wars, and this is dovetailed in a certain way with the reverberations and last sputterings of the culture wars of the 80s and 90s. So political science, as normal political science, is understood to mean something that mimics science, and where understanding politics is not, I think there was that great conversation earlier about literature as political, because it's about sort of, imagining, that politics is about imagining something new. That's not what political science studies. Political scientists are not interested in imagining something new. They're interested in measuring and predicting, right? So if you're a normal political scientist, you don't want to imagine something new. And if you do, then you are subject to disciplinary effects in various ways. So what the emphasis on measuring and predicting does is that it sort of creates a state centrism, because this is about the normal run of everyday politics within the state form, which is the sort of dominant form of politics, right? When I say that these methodology wars were reinforced by the last sputterings of the culture wars, what I mean is that there was a sense that the politicizing of culture that occurred in humanities departments and in some, sort of namby-pamby social sciences like anthropology, that these were actually silly and misdirected, inquiries, forms of inquiry, because these for the hard social scientists, these culture wars, or the effects of these culture wars, were seen to politicize the wrong kind of thing, and it was based on a kind of fundamental misunderstanding of what politics is, right? Which is, for the normal political scientist, very statist. It's about, again, measuring and predicting. So I think the state centrism and the normalization of inquiry has both methodological and political effects. The disciplining of me, who, I'm post-structural, post-colonial, anarcho-communist, queer, I'm interested in psychoanalysis, like all the wrong kinds of things to be interested in a political science department. In spite of all that, I thought, hey, I landed this job, I have, I think, a good pedigree, in terms of the politics of pedigrees. So I tried to do all the right things. I've published in the journals that I was supposed to publish in. I didn't quite get my book with a press that's recognized in political science as a good press, but is recognized in the humanities as, sort of an important critical, venue for a certain kind of critical humanities and sort of left philosophy. And so what I had done in thinking about myself in this way, and what I joked about, but it was only half joking, is that I had internalized the narrative of the dutiful son. Right? I had tried to be the dutiful son to my collective parents, my senior colleagues. And what had happened was that I think it created a divided subject. On the one hand, I was trying to do the things that I was most interested in, which is sort of pursuing critical theories in various forms in the analysis of politics, in the analysis of canonical political thinkers and not so canonical political thinkers. But at the same time, I was trying to professionalize. I was trying to trying to do the balancing act of being both critical and professionalizing at the same time within a field that was riven by methodology and was still riven by the culture wars, which had mostly been won by the wrong side. So I was publishing, I was trying to do, and I was doing it in a way that was sort of my own way, which was not the normal way. So I was publishing in the right venues. I mean, the American Political Science Review is golden. It's considered what I've heard my colleagues describe as a blue chip journal. So, using whatever, like a gambling metaphor. So I'd done things in my way, but what I was publishing on was not normal. It was not legible to them. So I've been disappointed. I've been denied tenure. But what I think is an interesting thing to take away from this, and is again, it's not a shocking conclusion for any of you, is that this disciplining becomes totally depoliticized. The dominant narratives for discipline and the disciplining of, what we call the disciplines, disciplining within the disciplines are professionalization, merit, responsibility, productivity, and the idea of discipline, of course, is that this is not just something that is, it's not just, a paddle with which the not so beautiful sun is spanked, but it's actually something that's internalized by both sides, right? So my senior colleagues were internalizing all of these narratives, and I was internalizing them, and that what I had done was sort of, tried to self-normalize without sort of realizing that that's what I was doing. As critical as I am, as much of a, sort of lover of reading Foucault as I am, I, was still falling into all of this, self-disciplining, self-normalization. And so I think that this depoliticization of the professionalism and the disciplining that occurs within the continuation of professionalization after you land a job, it's not true only in my own field. I mean, I think political science is in various ways such an anomaly because of its pretense toward objectivity. But I do think that, and we can talk about this in question and answer, I think that this is something to worry about in the humanities as well, right? Precisely because the precarity effects of neoliberalized universities creates an alibi for departments and for various sort of, power centers within departments to make certain kinds of decisions that are gatekeeping, choke point, disciplining decisions. So I think that this is, and that these will be depoliticized in the name of professionalization, productivity, what have you, right? So I think that this is not something that is as strange as political science is in its self-understanding and in outsiders' views of it. I think this is also something to worry about in the humanities as well. So we can talk about that more, and I can't think of any good analogies or anecdotes, but I do think that this disciplining that occurs within the context of precarity is actually that these go hand in hand and are important effects of on the other side once you actually do land the job. These are important effects that continue.
Would you mind just moving one seat over?
So I think my comments are going to be a little bit different. I'll let you guys try to draw the connection. But so I work with Unite Here, which is a labor union of hospitality, food service workers around the United States and Canada. And we're a relatively small union in the scheme of things, but we have about 300,000 members total, and about 100,000 in food service in particular. And I'm going to focus on food service because that's where my work is based. And so, last year, our union organized about 5,700 non-union food service workers into into the union, and thereby reduced, hopefully significantly, the precarity of those jobs in particular. It's a small splash in some ways and a significant one in others. About 1,000 of those workers were on university campuses. So we've been, I don't know where you're all from, but we've been for a long time, but also kind of recently organizing cafeteria workers on university campuses. The nature of these jobs, if we're going to and talking with workers in university cafeterias, there's especially workers that have been in those cafeterias for a long time, a narrative that I think is pretty consistent with, an intentional destabilization of the work and the jobs itself. These are jobs that are not only marked by kind of low wages and just sort of relatively difficult working conditions, but ones that are being pushed further towards instability. So whether part-time work on university campuses, functionally seasonal work, which is a problem, has been always, but you see one of the major companies in university food service has just declared for all of the non-union operations they have on campuses around the country that they're redefining full-time work. So instead of it being the number of hours you work in a given week, 30 or 35, which may have been considered strangely full-time before, they're now calculating it as the average number of hours you work per week over the entire year, knowing full well that you don't work in the summer, so that they can bring everyone's average number of hours below 30, thereby not getting the penalty under Obamacare and not having to give whatever scant benefits they were offering to their existing full-time employees, which were weak. But this is where they're going. And another example, not driven necessarily by the company but by the state, done some organizing in Indiana recently. In Indiana had changed the law, and I imagine more widespread, but allowing for workers who are quote unquote seasonal, and the definition of that is stretch that the company could choose whether or not those workers would be eligible to receive unemployment during the off-season. And so universities, we were working with workers from a couple of campuses there, and kind of in the midst of that, without telling anyone, the law had recently changed. These workers traditionally had, over the summer, been able to collect unemployment, and they were notified a very short amount of time in advance of the summer that this summer they would not be allowed to collect unemployment. And so you have these things that are kind of moving what is already both difficult and not the most stable work to begin with, pushing it further towards the margins. And I think that the ultimate conclusion of that path, which I think we don't just see in the service industry, is to make people interchangeable, make people replaceable. And I think that's a defining characteristic. And I want to put up one image that I think says a lot about that. So, this is not made up. This is from a hospitality industry magazine. It's an advertisement. You shouldn't have to sacrifice quality for price. We've got cooks and housekeepers, construction workers, many different service work people in a vending machine. You should be able to choose easily, and basically know what to expect, as if it is a candy bar or a bag of chips and a brand, that you know what you're getting. And so, beyond being like infuriating that this wasn't even, something that someone was saying, it is as if this is the case. This is how they want to advertise themselves as a company, and this is a major company in kind of temp services that does work in hotels and other parts of our industry. It's the attitude, right? This is pushing it to the margins where the work is not so much work anymore, and that's the context in which we're organizing to change not only the working conditions, but to change this attitude towards people. And so there's a couple of things I want to kind of point out in work that we've been doing in challenging that, and I think it takes, there's sort of traditional labor organizing, but to come up against this takes some creativity. So one way we've been challenging it in our campaigns is really focusing on and fostering the sense of community, and as a way to challenge the idea that people are interchangeable. So on university campuses, where, like I said, I think in the last couple of school years, we've organized cafeteria workers at about 30 universities. And a key part of that has been breaking down the barriers the best that we can between the university food service workers and the rest of the university. And particularly students and faculty and other sort of members of the university community. In some places, relationships between those folks exist, and we want to build that up and highlight that. In other places, where often both in the same place, the workers in the cafeteria behind the counter are functionally invisible, and we're trying to change that. And so we've done a lot of work involving students and faculty and different members of the university community in the organizing directly, not just as workers stand up and call for a change of work, and then we get students and professors to do a solidarity rally, which is very helpful, but relatively predictable, and has limitations in how much it can change this situation. It can change some things, but it can't necessarily change these sort of ideas. And so, professors, for example, have been involved in visiting workers at their homes, building real relationships with these folks outside of the campus context that sets this sort of division, and building power through more, collaborative organizing in some ways, to the point that one story, so in the organizing in Indianapolis, at a university, we were, workers had been organizing underground for some time, and students and professors had been part of that. All the organizing happened away from campus at people's houses and stuff, so that it was a secret. It was underground. The company didn't know, the university leadership didn't know, and one of the professors at this university, which was a Catholic university, she was actually a sister in the order that runs the university, was extremely involved, and folks that were really scared to talk about it and entertain the idea of what it would take to change the situation on campus. They wouldn't open the door for me, but they would open the door and talk to Sister Bonnie. And this came to the point. So then the workers took the campaign public, and we're at the sort of most tension-filled part of the campaign. And one of the things that everyone sort of prepares for is that the worker job will be threatened to be fired or whatever. We sort of build up for that, but in this case, none of the cafeteria workers had their jobs threatened. we had to build a powerful enough force that the company there held back. The one person whose job was threatened was the professor. The university set a policy that students or professors were not allowed to do work with the union organizing attempt. She said, and there was a bunch of people, but she was sort of singled out because she was kind of like the leader among the group of faculty that was involved. And she was sent numerous messages, and the provost came to her office and directly threatened her job. She was someone who had been a professor at the university for over 20 years and had also studied undergrad there. She had like a 30 to 40 year connection to this university, and her job was threatened because she was trying to support the cafeteria workers who made nearly minimum wage to change their working conditions, and they didn't get threatened at all. So the solidarity that was built through the relationships and the focus on community was a key part of, the afternoon that the provost told her that her job was threatened, she went and spoke at a campus-wide rally. So she called their bluff, which was amazing, and that's part of how we won that. The other thing, just quickly on a different point, in challenge is changing the work itself. In the introduction, so I worked on this program called Real Food, Real Jobs for our union, in trying to be creative about how we challenge this idea of pushing the work to be more and more interchangeable and replaceable. The food itself very much matters. And what we've seen in institutional food service for a number of years is a move, a couple of decades now, is a move towards more frozen, pre-processed food, like real junk. And the reason that has happened was never because anyone thought that food was better than the freshly cooked and prepared food. But it cut labor costs down. The purpose of that is to cut labor costs, and so you talk to workers on university campus who've been there for a long time, and my favorite, most concise line comes from a worker at a university in Boston who said, they took away my knives and gave me scissors. And when people that are, trained, cooked, and whose the work itself was stripped down to the most barest piece, that it becomes more and more interchangeable over time, cuts the standards. And so we, as a more of a long-term project, set out to try to do more work in collaboration with the food movement to challenge the trend. The food movement is a whole separate discussion about challenges there, but there are two concurrent trends in the kind of food service world, one towards more automation and interchange, and one towards not just local organic produce, but what that means of going back to actually cooking in these places. And so we've been both trying to campaign to push towards that, setting up training programs and stuff for workers, food workers in airports, for example, and stuff to try to take another spin on challenging the way the work has been redefined over a number of years. So that's a couple of the things we're working on.
I'm Chris Newfield. I'm really very pleased to be here. I think this is a great project, and I'm very happy to be on this panel, having heard the talks. There's a lot of overlap. I'm going to be kind of ending up where Sean was with alt communities, talking a bit about Kyle's overlapping with your discussion of organizing and kind of moving towards quality food preparation, quality teaching is kind of an essential part of the process that I think we're entering into. And I'm going to talk a little about the divide itself that Jimmy was talking about. And I also want to say getting denied tenure is an absolutely brutal process, and so I want to honor your courage both for having survived it, it's not nothing, and also for talking about it out loud, which is very helpful. the counter narrative that I'm trying to present here. So bear with me just for a couple of minutes with doom and gloom that you kind of already know. It's kind of real politics. There are 4 primary groups in the university. None of them have an interest in ending precarity, and most of them, on the surface, have self-interests that are oriented around maintaining it. So for tenure-track faculty, graduate students and precarious labor are service workers who maintain knowledge production operations at a lower cost than would otherwise be possible. And when the cost domestically gets too high, some fields at least look to outsource and offshore that labor to other countries. The collaboration between the College of Engineering at Berkeley and a campus that's not really actually a university, but kind of a business park outside of Shanghai is one example. Universities are doing this all over the country as a way of pushing labor costs down even further. The faculty don't like them, but they participate. We participate in it. I'm one of them. University administrators, their job is essentially to, in a kind of a Taylorist, a digital Fordist context, reduce labor costs. You cannot really be an administrator in this country unless you accept Balin's cost disease understanding of where the costs come from, which is basically you have humans instead of machines. So the goal is to replace humans with the machines, and that's how you get productivity increases in service industries on the model of getting productivity increases in industry, right, in manufacturing. It's a completely false analogy, as some economists actually have been writing about for a little while. But nonetheless, I think it's the second tier paradigm that's still pretty much at work in university management. Staff, it's a competition for resources. They're getting fired and downsized and pooled in nasty ways all over the country. So their interest is in a way in trying to claw back resources away from teaching labor, and that of course means adjuncting. And then student debt, it's a horrible problem. Tuition increases, horrible problem. Students are really, I cannot buy the reader for your class at UC Santa Barbara, which is the sort of highest family income UC campus. I just get emails like that all week. So there's privilege, the part of tenure-track faculty, there's managerialism, there's competition, there's student cost and student debt, and these are kind of like the 4 horsemen of academic precarity. They're moving it forward, right? There are some problems with this analysis that I just gave. I think it's actually wrong. I think, and this is my basic message, the situation is bad, but the situation is much more fluid than we think. Okay, there's some macro trends and there's some more local things. But first, I'm just going to say what I think is wrong, kind of analytically and psychologically with the analysis I just gave. The first is it's not very dialectical in the traditional sense of that term. Secondly, I think this is a huge flaw. It is depressive. And I'm thinking of Melanie Klein. It is the depressive position, which is a situation in which there's a kind of a caretaker, or a figure that is supposed to be a caretaker, and one loves and hates them at the same time. And it's a horrible position that produces a kind of ambivalence that leads to this, I think, this particular position, which is that my victory will produce my being abandoned by the caretaker. That is, to the extent that I, as precarious labor, succeed in de-precaricizing myself, I will be facing a fearful post-precarity position of having destroyed the thing that's taken care of. Okay, so it's very unpleasant and it's depressing. And it's terrible. So I think there's a problem of not recognizing that. I'm not saying it's a binding condition. I'm saying not recognizing it as a binding condition. And I'm going to try to talk about what we can do if we recognize it in a second. And the third thing, and this is really Paolo Freire and Henry Giroux and some people that are kind of working in that tradition. This analysis I just gave the Noir analysis, doesn't work very well with the divided psychologies of both sides of the equation of oppressor and oppressed. And the the hard lesson that Freire was always trying to teach is that the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is about the liberation of the oppressed, must always at the same time be a pedagogy of the liberation of the oppressor. And that's creepy. Because, and we're talking about this right at the beginning, why the hell are we, you said this, why the hell are we responsible for fixing, the graduate students, the adjuncts, why? Well, Fred is saying basically that's how it always is, and the good news is, the bad news is that, you know the bad news. The good news is that it's seeing that as the condition is a form of power that allows for taking the next steps. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do just in a few minutes is go back through those particular positions and see if they become a little bit more fluid if we manifest or force to the surface the depressive position in each of them, the stuckness, and see if maybe there's a sort of a better outcome that comes from doing that. The first, I'll start this time with tenure track faculty. We as a group treat ourselves as a declining function in society, as a defeated force. And this is something that is not sufficiently acknowledged by us, and we are not forced to acknowledge it by others in the institution, starting with, and again, this is not a burden, but I try and present this as an opportunity, by graduate students. And my first MLA was my first year in graduate school, which is in 1981 in New York. And I came into the party suite early to hear a person who'd just been teaching my George Eliot class, speaking to someone in Louisiana, begging that person to interview his favorite graduate student. And he finally just lost control, and he says, no, you don't understand. She's my favorite student ever, and she's on the job market for the third year, and she's never had an interview. And he was really just beside himself. And I thought, shit, I know who that is. And he loves her, and he thinks I'm really mediocre. So I assumed that it was my survival strategy. Actually, Jimmy talked about this a little bit. Was going to be to keep my head down, rather than say, look, what the hell kind of profession is this? Where you're begging and you're practically in tears. You have to change the austerity conditions. This is 30 years ago. You have to change the austerity conditions, and you have to start tonight as soon as you get rejected by this guy who won't actually review or interview your student. So there's, it's overdue. This kind of a confrontation that's going to make my kind very uncomfortable, but that really has to happen, and we barely talk about it with each other. It's the essence of deprofessionalization, and we have an interest in not being deprofessionalized ourselves and not seeing that happen to our students. So, anyway, I could go on, but it's just infuriating to think about the antiquity of this problem and the unchanging nature, the stuckness of the MLA, of the just of the whole sort of policy apparatus that's around that. Okay, students. I have had some good experiences with surfacing the working conditions of the people that are primarily teaching University of California students, and by that I mean teaching assistants. I have 200 people in my detective fiction course this quarter, and I'm grading 20 of them, and there are 4, now down to 3 TAs who are teaching normally 2 and now 3 sections. And when I explain what is going on to my undergraduate students about their graduate students, that teach me cheap feeling goes away. They do not say that. They say, they get the point that in order to have real cooking and real teaching and a real education, and by real I mean 21st century, not the factory model that is no longer getting anybody a job, actual paying job. They say, yeah, we know, we the millennials or whatever you want to call them, do get the fact that the factory model isn't working. It's just all we can afford, and if you're going to tell us how we can get out of that, we're going to listen to you. There was a great blog post that you may have seen by Catherine Harris, who teaches English at San Jose State, called Drowning and No One Cares. And I think she, at the very end, before she hit publish, put a question mark at the end of that, because I've done that too, just to make it seem less totally dismal. It's a brilliantly explicit, it's overworked porn in the best sense. Triple X, and it's really about how many students and how many hours and the whole deal. That has to happen a lot more. It's like, we've had a renaissance of quit lit this year. This is kind of like, I won't quit lit. But, in the process of not quitting, I am going to make graphic what exactly happens to me in order to educate you. And I think that a faculty have abandoned staff to shared services, to getting bused to basically server farms and cubicle farms, and actually now it's kind of open office settings, off of campuses where they're completely disconnected from academic life. What has to happen there, and again, this is a tenure track faculty job, is to invite staff into the academic creation process, make them academic partners, and insist with administrators that they create the conditions for that to be possible. And that means bringing all those shared services people at Berkeley and at Michigan back onto campus. And I have to say that there is a ray of hope in 2013, in which the faculty senate at the Ann Arbor campus of the University of Michigan voted a denunciation of this policy, which of course the president immediately said was not going to affect it. But at least there's a struggle, and there's a making explicit of the bullshit nature of a shared services model that comes out of consultancy that is using an understanding of efficiency and tailorization that really, honest to God, has not changed since the 1950s. And who is buying that in the industrial world? Really only academic managers. And then finally, administration itself. Okay, there is a bit of a depressive position that they are in, which is they know everybody hates them now. And that's a sad thing for them. In that faculty have abandoned administrators as partners. It's really go to these us to ask for money, but it's not like you're not going to do anything for me, are you? You're not going to do anything for my students. It's just a retreat and withdraw, non-confrontational thing. It's unfortunately not confrontational enough. And that is true. Staff are just have retreated. Students don't really have that much interaction, at least at a big corporate place like mine. I think that there are some effective ways of getting their attention. One that I've been trying is this blogging about how budget cuts and austerity is a form of oppression. It's a form of not only exploitation, which is key, labor exploitation, but it is also a form of oppression of future students through the creation of debt and of the employees that are actually working at the university. And I have succeeded in making a number of administrators feel bad. But again, the issue is how do you go from feeling bad to flipping out of that depression and into actually doing something about it. So the thing that I propose is kind of first leveraging some good trends, which is that basically tailorization is finished in the services. And the quality versions, the big privates and so on, are running away from them as quickly as they can. It's all small. It's team-based learning. It's how do you create active learning. It's flipping the classroom, this thing that Kathy Kohler at Coursera thought she had invented is, of course, what we know as the seminar. And the problem is that you can't do it in public schools very often. Literally once every 4 years for an English major at UC Santa Barbara. Once. So there's a knowledge that this isn't working educationally, but the business model, the business structure is not caught up with that. There's a contradiction there that I think we can work with. And then the second thing that's happening, as I've already mentioned, and that is public anger about the limited nature of educational quality that is coming out of American universities. And there's a business discourse about this, there's a parental discourse about this, there's a student discourse about this. I saw it most intensely at the least well-funded school that I spoke at in 2011, that is Portland State, where engineering students came to the AAUP meeting that I was speaking at, the union meeting, and told these horror stories about courses no longer having professors, or losing their professor 3 days before it starts, getting professors in that had never taught the subject before, and then them having to basically teach themselves and setting up these collaborative mechanisms for actually doing that. So these are some positive trends to leverage, and the suggestion that I would make, and this is where it kind of cycles back to what Sean and Kyle are both talking about, is bootleg university construction. This is really easy financially in the humanities. The scientists are trapped in these really high overhead research operations, and that's good, and that's also really bad for them. We are not, and so I've been thinking a little bit about this thing that I'm calling, as opposed to contrasting gold U and blue U, where the privatization is basically the only way that this other model, this kind of Berkeley model, can really maintain itself, by being a kind of a poorer, larger version of Stanford. That's just idiotic. And then the second way, which is that, and it basically works like, well, I have actually a paragraph which I think I'm going to read you because it'll be faster than me just kind of stumbling through this. It involves schools with large enrollments and faculty working with graduate students, with postdocs, and with non-tenure track faculty in their setup with collaborative instructional learning teams that are also research operations. So I'm talking about storefront colleges in which people don't leave their jobs, but they maintain the university base and the non-university base at the same time. And I put this in the future tense as a hypothesis. Blue U will unfold through a series of small experiments. By 2015, continuing closures of gold U humanities departments, coupled with spreading awareness of the role of large enrollment humanities departments in subsidizing other disciplines, will provoke strong majors. Literature professors at a range of public colleges and universities like University of California, San Diego, San Jose State, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, North Carolina, A&M, will write a manifesto called The Case for Succession. They do this in concert with graduate students and adjunct faculty. The 30 co-signers each pledge to offer one course per year off campus in their area of literary, cultural, or theoretical enterprise. At first, they will do this as an overload, noting that most humanities doctoral advising was already done as an overload. Later, they will develop an infrastructure on the model of Jacobin publishing and thriving arts communities in various cities and towns. Some colleges, seeing this as handy outsourcing, allow students to get university credit for these courses, for which the university will now pay far less. Since the 30 signers of this group, among them teach more than 10,000 students per year. When I teach 500, I teach. In traditional lectures and seminars, the experiment will attract the interest of philosophically congenial platform developers. The Soros Foundation will fund 2 years of what future Blue U founders call experimental universities, or kitchen colleges, or bootleg universities, as I think of them. Student enrollments at the baby Blue U's will be strong, since student experience on public university campuses has become so plainly degraded through years of growing class size and reduced access to professors, graders, advisors, and basic classroom space. Note that in contrast to MOOCs, Blue U's use online technology to support face-to-face developmentalist instruction across the equivalent of kitchen tables. Okay, so that's a little piece of this fantasy that I'm trying to make plausible. I would love to know if any of this makes sense to you, or if it just sounds like a lot more work for nothing, which is not the idea, right? In the humanities, though, I just don't see the value added any longer of administrators, of Ford-like bureaucratic superstructures. And I think this is worth really pointing out very directly now to these administrative apparatuses, and we're kind of carrying them around like a camper shell on a hike. And the question is why. So my suggestion is, let's start to actually teach without them. Let's see what we can do on our own on the outside. And I think that this, actually a lot of the imagination of this is going to come from contingent faculty and from graduate students. You are not actually tenure institutionalized. That's a kind of an emancipatory position. You also know about the two traditions that we inherit of knowledge in itself. You know, Kantian's lower faculties that do not actually serve the state, but can do without the state. Or Aristotelian liberal arts that are about enjoyment, where enjoyment should be defined as not self-exploiting, and not economically determined labor, basically, for its own sake. So what I would like to invite us to do is to have a conversation about the issues that all of us have been raising, about how to make real, not just alt academia and alternative careers to the university, but an alt university that all of us can live in justly and in a sort of a viable intellectual context. Thanks.
So I'll just take questions from up here. And maybe before you start speaking, if you could at least give your name out so we can have that as a reference point. Joe?
I'm Joe. Thanks for that. That was wonderful. I'm very intrigued by the idea of a sort of alt university. I was working for the last couple of years with the Occupy University project, sort of thinking about these kinds of issues, and numerous problems arise. Let's put it obviously. One that I think we encountered to just sort of a theoretical level as well as a practical level was that a lot of us were very wedded initially to the basic conception that students pay for their education and teachers are paid. And eventually, after a lot of discussion, we came around to the idea that we had to let that go, and that the money had to come from somewhere else. I'd be interested to hear about whether that kind of shift to that kind of logic resonates with this new idea. Just because we started to feel that the very idea that the student pays for something that the teacher has, and then there's this transaction there, means that really the student's labour is not being paid for. The students' labour, they have to pay to work. And I don't mean working on the side of doing actual academic work. I mean, it seems to me that academic work in pursuit of, a education, which is not just imagined for your personal benefit, but imagined for the benefit of society around you, ideally, is something that is labour that should be compensated. In many countries, it is the case, but yeah, I don't know how you feel about that.
Can you just say what was the model that you went to? How did it actually work?
Well, that's a good question. We were thinking a lot about trying to say, okay, we ourselves, the Occupy University, we worked with no money whatsoever, no money changed hands. No labor was compensated at all. We just didn't have any resources. But the question is, where does the money come from? It seems to me that the assumption that I guess what I'm trying to say is that in some systems, like for example, my partner works in Sweden, no problem, the state pays for it all. Education's free. Even many of the students are paid to go to their education because there's a sort of social democrat dream that the students' labour is compensated just as the teacher's labour is compensated. Everyone in the classroom is labouring, therefore everyone should be compensated. But if you have a problem with the state, as one might, then you have a question of where does the resource come from. It seems to me that it has to come from some sort of communal structure, not via a sort of relationship between the student and the teacher. Does that make sense?
I think that's completely right. I mean, just really quickly, in the beginning of the way that I think it would be free, and it would be paid for by the state salaries of the employed faculty who are basically giving free labor to it. That's not a sustainable model, but it is, the longer argument is that we're already doing this. So we may as well do it in a space that can serve as a template for something else. And then I think from there it would have to be self-organized in fashions that are unpredictable. Startups in the United States work this way, where basically they just burn money once they've found it because they don't, it's just they're running at a loss. And so I think that after the initial results are established, foundations, private benefactors were passing the hat in the way they do in the churches that have basically taken over the American media over the last 40 years started out doing. That it would be a step process of expansion. And I guess the other driver for me would be, and this has to kick in at some point, would be student and parent activism around the shafting that their kids are getting by being put in factory models that don't work. So if they actually have an experience of something else, an independent study that is clearly identified as not functioning. This is the crucial thing for me. You can't get this at UC Santa Barbara. I am going to the downtown library, that I think could create a different kind of political thinking on the part of the folks who really do have the ear of state legislatures more than faculty or staff.
Brian and then Laura.
So I just want to kind of respond to your talk, Chris, and that I really enjoyed it, and I think I feel like we're on the same side. So I'm just want to give some feedback. I'm like,
Yeah, please.
kind of trying to think through some things based on what you're saying. This was my initial reaction. It sounds like you're trying to to beat them at their own game, that you're going to win by being more efficient. And somehow that's kind of something I was hearing. I'm just wondering if that was the case or not. And also I was thinking it's kind of just putting off the political struggle that has to occur eventually, right? Like, why not just have the political struggle now and do away with administrators, who have seized control of these institutions and are transforming them in ways, that are detrimental. Because I'm just thinking, talking about CUNY and militarization, I don't know if the administrator is really oppressive to me. A lot of people I know have been, sent to jail by university administrators, have had their lives, pretty, dramatically transformed, which is not to say, but those are the kinds of things that come to my mind when I was listening. And the other thing that is kind of a question, for example, like at the University of Michigan, they have $2.1 billion of debt, construction debt, so it's like, how are you going to unwind it? And that basically means that you're going to have to continue, you're not going to be able to get rid of high tuition because you're going to have to take in student debt in order to unwind that debt. Or you're going to have to say, we're not going to pay that debt, we refuse to do it, which would be a political kind of struggle, So trying to kind of reimagine university, like, it seems, so those are just some of the things I was thinking about. And, if you have things to kind of say, like, oh, that's not what I was trying to say, or maybe I would deal with that in this way or whatever, but I'm just trying to think through things, in a collaborative way. And maybe if other people want to touch on some of the militarization or talk about how those things look from your particular viewpoint, I would be, really excited to hear that as well. So.
That's really helpful. You guys want to say something? I think of this more as a kind of a political movement that is now, it's not deferred, that is based on professional skill. And so it has all the potential limitations of and liabilities of the sort of the craft union movements prior to sort of mass unions. And I'm worried about that. I haven't thought that through. And so your concern about that, I think, is really valid. And I guess what I would want to do with this is to see it as more of a coalitional process. So there's all these other things, particularly debt strike, they have to continue to move forward. And so I don't see this as anything like a replacement for any of that. It's more like a supplemental project in which people that think people should pay their debts, for example, like parents of my students, could relate to somebody who's trying to do something for their kid that hasn't been being done by the state-funded institution. And that goes to your first point, which is it's really not about efficiency. It's kind of it's not efficiency in the Taylor sense. It's anti-Taylorist, and it's very much about face-to-face, and it's really about absurd kind of commitments to human development or sort of individual development. And the huge obstacle there is that it's really labor intensive, and we're all already overworked, some of us more than others. So this is another obstacle. All I'm trying to do is find a pilot supplemental to the other activities that you've been talking about that could spawn better ideas than the ones I just put out there.
Thank you for mentioning the militarization piece. Obviously, that's happening at many campuses, and I didn't mean to diminish that, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I think I think, I like what everybody was saying, right? But I think for me, right, coalition building is important. Cross-institution building is important. Many people have been talking about it, this convening, right? Working together in the future, not just at the next MLA, but maybe we could work together to create and organize and implement some coordinated actions across our campuses, across the country. I actually think that's really one of the lessons I've learned, at least from folks like Unite Here, Fight for 15, a living wage campaigns that have been going on there. Some of it's been loosely coordinated, but coordinated nevertheless, right? The militarization piece is really hard. For one thing, universities could sell, right? I think universities should be downsized, right? Like, instead of us being downsized, right? Instead of students, communities, faculty being downsized, the universities themselves should be downsized, right? My partner, for instance, is an alumnus of NYU, right? That's sort of like the case example par excellence, right, of crazy building, collateralized by student tuition and all other sorts of things, right? Collateralized by United Arab Emirates, right, because of the Abu Dhabi campus. They own all the real estate. If they sold, right, the question is how we get them to do that. That would free up so much money, right? I've also done organizing with the Free Cooper Union effort that's been going on, sort of reached a peak when the students occupied the president's office for about 40 days last spring. They sold one of the most valuable pieces of real estate, right? The board of trustees at Cooper Union, with the full advisement of the administrators, and it did nothing, right, for preserving free tuition because it was so mismanaged. Some of this is, I think, criminal level mismanagement that university administrators and board of trustees have engaged in, right? We've also seen this at UVA, as Laura was so effectively talking about yesterday. I happen to be an alumnus of UVA, so I was following that really well. We've gotten to a point in this country where people with power are increasingly acting capriciously, right? When I talk about this with some of my advisors, they always make the point, well, the U.S. empire is in decline, right? And that's having all sorts of psychic effects, right, that are causing people to engage, to really, to lash out, right? And so I think there's a lot of fundamental work that we have to be doing in this country, and I think the political process has to be almost a side point right now, because I think the political process gets us reform, it doesn't get us change.
Well, keep taking questions. I just want to say we were supposed to end at 7:30 with the subconference. We can do whatever we want. So Laura, and then I'll go to Ben.
So thanks. This was really, really wonderful. And so I'm hoping to ask a question that can get Kyle involved. And so my question is that I like this idea of blue university. I would call it red university. But with some caveats about how this is going to be funded and what this means about efficiency. But I think for us to do any of this, we need to move beyond, or we need to grapple with fear. And the fear that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, that if we start to dismantle the university, if we make material our demands, we might end up with something that actually is worse, or we won't know what to do with it, or we could all be out of work, or whatever. And so I sometimes feel very pessimistic about how bad it's going to have to get before people are willing to take that step. But I love this movement that you were talking about, Kyle, where it seems like people are not hitting rock bottom before they say, I deserve better, and I can be courageous even though I know that I can be fired, and that I can, instead of feeling like I need to be employee of the month to keep my job, I can turn to someone working next to me and say, we both deserve better. And so I was hoping that maybe you could start to talk about what does that look like? How do you do that? How do you start to have a conversation with someone where you don't deny, you don't act as though that fear isn't real, but you begin to move collectively to a place where you can say, we will take strength in each other, we will try to move past this fear?
Yeah, I think fear is the biggest. There's all sorts of, structures set up that create the fear, but when it comes down to doing the organizing, fear is that thing. And, when you're talking, I thought about a Christian who is a food service worker at Pomona College in California, and when we talk in all these campuses, we talk to people. Part of it is being open about it. Part of it is putting out there and talking about what is on the line, and just what that is. And it's so many campaigns we talk to people through the idea that they're going to put their job on the line together as a group. But most places it doesn't happen. At Pomona, Christian was fired. He and almost the entire organizing committee of that workplace were fired after they sort of led over 90% of their coworkers to sort of publicly call for change. And so he was fired, and he kept organizing at Pomona. And when he speaks, or when he would talk to people, he was like, look, they could have fired me any day. They didn't care about me to begin with. And that, I can look at it as I got fired because I stood up and tried to change it, but the reality was what I was trying to change was the fact I could get fired any single day for anything. And so, it took a couple of years, but he kept organizing, and we won this year, or 2013, we Christian and his coworkers won that fight, and he actually got hired back to work. He quit his job a couple months later and works full-time as an organizer at this point. But it's that process. I mean, for him, he was fired, and then went and continued to talk to people through that fear, just by being open about. It's not necessarily that you're at rock bottom, but if you're in this precarious position, you don't know when you're going to hit it. And, it's relationships and real kind of building trust between people, from whether, generally is in the context where you're openly talking about what's at stake, good and bad, is sort of where that comes through. There's not a magic to it other than building the trust and relationships. I guess, I don't know. Yeah.
What about Ben and then Ben at Marsha?
So, at the risk of taking too much of a big picture perspective here, I just wanted to ask what you all think about whether the fate of the university, public university, the university as we know it, maybe not a move, is tied up with the global economy, the global totality, which is determining all of our individual fates, it seems. And if that's the case, to what extent do we all have to, as teachers, pedagogues, scholars, need to be focused on fighting austerity, getting behind a campaign of real public investment in jobs and a jobs program, and something like basic income. And so to what extent do we have to sort of, especially as scholars in the humanities, bring back the critique of economics and political economy in kind of the old school sense if we are going to keep intellectual life alive in any kind of meaningful democratic way?
I think we all want to say yes.
But how do we have to organize that and think seriously about what we can do, say in the publications that we have to put our energy into that kind of serious public engagement, you know?
I mean, I'll just say really briefly, I mean, that's a great question, obviously, and one that I've been thinking about as well, right? I mean, as Lenore mentioned in my bio, right, I work on questions of global political economy, decolonization, and cultural reform, right? I mean, my dissertation is going to be on global gangster culture after structural adjustment, right? Which is typically seen as a foreign policy, right? But it's austerity all the same, right? And we've experienced structural adjustment, right, since Reagan in the U.S. It was actually doubled down upon by Clinton and has continued to be carried forward by Obama, right? I sort of erased Bush 2 from that for obvious reasons, because I have a depressive complex related to him still. But, I mean, I get questions all the time, well, what does economics have to do with, your scholarship as a literary student, right? I was at a conference in Turkey this fall, because I have a whole critique of world literature as well as you can imagine, and I was talking about my dissertation and my other research interests, and the same question was, what's literary here? I got this from one of my advisors, right? What's literary here? I think, for one thing, I think literary, is an antiquated form. I'll throw that out there. But I think that, it's interdisciplinary. We absolutely have to be interdisciplinary. I don't like the word team so much, but I definitely like the word collective, right? Communities. Like, we have to be forming communities, because I think the task in terms of research and organizing is so great that no single person can do it, right? It has to be self-formed collectives that are taking on all of these questions, right? I mean, I think that's what the academy at its best could be doing right now. I think for all the reasons we've been talking about, it's not at all set up like that, which is a struggle. So,
I think of it as micro and macro. On the micro level, I've been trying to get my colleagues interested in budget studies for 20 years. I've written 400 posts about budgets. Half of my book, I'm making books about cross subsidies. And I don't really think that we can defend ourselves unless we understand, or at least have a designated group that really gets that. This morning I wrote a post in response to Jerry Brown's budget, trying to connect his rationale for not really funding higher education, Cal State's community colleges, as well as UC in California, to Thatcherite critiques of basically public services inherently inefficient, trying to get people to think, oh, Brown is not being reasonable, kind of centrist Democrat. He actually has these incredibly right-wing arguments that he's using to see if maybe that would get people thinking. So, I will try anything to get folks published. We're focused a little bit on that. Macro, for me, the world systems person that I really like the best is Arrighi, and particularly the Adam Smith in Beijing book, which has been pretty criticized by some China scholars around it. The basic claim, the one-sentence version, is that the Taylor de-skilling that we've all been talking about, and that you all, I think, were talking about yesterday as well, is dysfunctional economically. That the capitalist trajectory that the West has been on of replacing craft skill or people skill or interactivity with unilateral sort of machine-based forms of efficiencies is over. As it had a 200-year period of value adding that was not actually reproducible with this labor-intensive industrious revolution, as he called what was happening in East Asia. And then now the tide has turned. So I think we should really surf that tide, which is going away from the kind of measures that we've all been critiquing here.
My question for Kyle very specifically, and for anyone else as well, but thinking about what you were saying about building relationships between food and service workers and faculty and food and service workers and graduate students. Also thinking that in our early discussion today, there were people saying that, these are all topics we know about, and what we need is like a practical toolkit. Like, we need to take some broad, and people were great at like theorizing, But so I'm wondering, for those
most simply is just go back and talk to people. It's like I've gone around to campuses talking to students, and mostly undergrads, but every day you go onto a campus, or especially at the beginning of school years or whatever, and you employ many skills to get to know lots of people that you don't know, that come from different places, have different backgrounds, spend their days doing different things, but you share an experience of that university or that place or whatever thing, and you have conversations and you make friends, and that's how you make all the friends you have. I do think it's really important to strip away different things that make it seem more complicated to get to know the folks that are working the service on your campus. And so I would start there. And I wouldn't go and try to talk to people about, if they're union or if they're not, or what their economic condition is or whatever. Just go get to know people like you would other people. That's the starting point. And that doesn't change everything. Changing the power dynamic takes a lot more than that. It takes, steps beyond that. But if you want to start, I would just start with that. I would start with talking to folks and not break down the own barrier that makes, whatever makes you think that would be more difficult than talking about, or what actually does make it more difficult because of different social norms, but that makes that more difficult than going and building a relationship with anyone else on your campus. And we can go a long way if we start that process.
I think teachers really quickly that when we were doing work in my grad student this past year over human resources redesign stuff, the human resources pages can be great sites with information about what restructuring is going on in terms of service industry jobs. So it's not the same thing as your question, but it was really, really useful for us in getting a grasp of the broad picture of where cuts were being made and we should see across all scales, especially in service work. So Marcia?
Well, I wondered, I had a question for you about the, how did that worker survive after he quit? But he kept going, he kept organizing. How did he live?
We helped him find a job in another food service place in Los Angeles.
Place.
Yeah, so he worked another job, but in his off time, he went and kept organizing his.
So he was fired from job A where he was for organizing, got another job, and then he
Kept organizing a previous job A.
Right. They didn't kick him out of
Well, at people's houses, right? He had relationships, so he wasn't in the workplace, but he was organizing those coworkers.
What I was considering, with your argument, Chris, I wondered, when you depend on the foundations and the philanthropic world, I always feel I feel negative. Even though I understand that and to me it's always been an intrinsic paradox that you're asking the people who made their megas, from your batch or your father's batch or somebody else's, they got too much profit. Nobody should have that much profit. The Koch brothers. I don't want to use tissue paper anymore. But, somehow they did that. They got that through some kind of brilliance, obviously a managerial brilliance, and the need of people. So that part of my question is, if kids go to this blue university or yellow university or whatever, they won't have a degree. Or you're saying they would get a degree, they might get a degree because you force the university to be giving these off-campus degrees, right? So that's a little, then would there be the fight between the on-campus degree and the off-campus degree, which is similar to the online degree and the non-online degree, and then you're asking people to donate their labor. It's just very confusing, and I think about alternative universes, in terms of the CSA movement, the community supported agriculture movement, where, you ally with a farm that has in turn gotten alliances from Equity Trust Company and all that, Equity Trust Foundation, and you've eliminated the middleman. You've even eliminated the farmer's market, and you are dealing directly with the farmer. You pay them at the beginning of the year for how many seeds to plant there, and you've got a different universe going, right? So And I think that sort of, and I'm thinking also of the retiree movement, where retirees come together and teach each other. All they get is a space somewhere. And they pay also a minimal. And some of the universities have supported that. So, I mean, and that idea, and homeschooling is like another sort of thing. I don't necessarily, the collective of parents to get together and support homeschooling. So I understand the notion of an alternative, and some alternatives seem to have worked better than others, but it just does have a lot of issues in it. And then the other thing I wanted to mention to the people here is that, there's an organization called U.S. Labor Against the War. And they are one of the initiatives, and there's not that much, some unions, unions have joined it. It doesn't preclude individuals from joining it later. But they're trying to establish an initiative to convert military jobs, jobs that are used for war production, to show how you can change those jobs, and have people who produce the electronic chips for some bomb or other to learn how to do solar roof replacement. So it seems to me that starts to come into a larger picture of what you have to change in order to change the economy, maybe one piece at a time. I mean, the military is gigantically organized. Why not take the military apparatus and push for it to be used to, I don't know what, stop the rain or whatever it is. I mean,
these are all really important points that would have to be worked out in what is now the renamed Red University. And I don't think it's going to attract Gates money. That's not what I was thinking of. And I obviously would prefer community funding and collaborative funding rather than having that kind of puppet possibility from a bigger private one. But it would be done in stages, and you would just see how people react and evolve from that.
I was going to take Karen's question last, and then we'll
I had a sort of later question. Something you said about how we already knew we were donating, already to alternative universities. We just don't know what. I accidentally found out that in a meeting at Dean's office in Arts and Sciences that all the people who were invited were all celebrating and excited because the English department and one other department was turning over 150% profit that was going into their coffers. That didn't go back into the English department, of course, because of adjunct labor. And my point is, if you even hire someone on adjunct labor, just think about if you've already got some profit built in that can help the alternative university kind of, take a toll and get started, because I think a lot of adjuncts would rather work for alternative university for the same price that they're, working for major for-profit and allegedly non-profit universities. I'm just saying, there's a lot of non-transparency about profit that a lot of people would get really angry about. You might have a lot of people come over in droves to teach alternative view for very little cost. And Kyle, I just wanted to say, what's going on with your group of people that's been happening to contingent labor in the profession and education for a long time. It's almost impossible for any of us to get unemployment in the summer. And what you're talking about now, and the idea about the student credit hour, being what the schools have traditionally legitimated what is considered full-time, what isn't considered full-time. They've been messing with contingent labor for a long time, and they're doing everything now. So it's a good reason for us to join forces. That's all.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. It's been a really fabulous past 2 days.